All right, welcome back to the fourth. This will be the fourth week of the Stoic Mindfulness and Resilience training segment we're on here. And so well done for everybody that's made it here to the fourth. And this will be the final week that we focus on this. We're mainly going to look at ways to maintain your well-being in the long term by anticipating future adversity and potential setbacks and preparing yourself to cope with them resiliently. So we're nearing the end of this segment here. But what will happen next? Are you simply going to revert back to your previous habits, or will you take forward some aspects of what you've learned? Will your future ways of responding be different from your responses in the past? So it's time now to prepare for the future by building on what you've learned. How can you ensure that you remember the most helpful parts, address any problems or obstacles you've still got to overcome, and anticipate any potential future setbacks? Pause to consider what advice you'd give someone else who was nearing the end of something like this to help ensure they continue to benefit. So the final stage here in training a psychological skill often concentrates on generalization or applying it to a wider and wider range of situations, or relapse prevention, or anticipating potential setbacks in the future and preparing for them in advance. So the ancient Stoics were interested in achieving comprehensive and lasting personal transformation. So it's not surprising that they employed a similar approach. They did seek to address short-term emotional problems, somewhat like we would in modern counseling or psychological therapy, such as coping with bereavement or other traumatic life events. However, most of the time, their focus was on building long-term psychological well-being and preparation for coping with future setbacks, which is similar to what we would call emotional resilience building today. To put it another way, Stoicism is more than a therapy. It's a philosophy of life, as William Irvine, the author of the book Guide to a Good Life, put it. With that being said, even in the ancient world, many people were initially drawn to Stoicism as a way of coping with short-term emotional challenges, and only later became convinced of the philosophical truth of its underlying doctrines and its value as an actual way of life. One of the best-known strategies employed in ancient Stoicism is called the premeditation of adversity, or the premeditatio malorum in Latin. This involves training yourself in advance to face future misfortunes or setbacks with philosophical equanimity by repeatedly visualizing typical catastrophes or losses as if they're happening right now while practicing Stoic equanimity. So William Irvine, going back to him again, describes a similar technique in his best-selling book on Stoicism. The book I just said, A Guide to the Good Life, which he calls negative visualization, although the rationale he presents is somewhat different from the ancient Stoics. So what the Stoics describe happens to be very similar to one of the most robustly established techniques in research on modern psychotherapy called imaginal exposure. Many different names are used to describe roughly similar techniques. We know quite a lot now about the psychological processes involved in this strategy and the best way to make it work. The most important fact is that anxiety and many other negative feelings, generally speaking, tend to naturally abate over time if exposure is repeated and prolonged enough and certain interfering factors are prevented. Psychologists call the process by which anxiety naturally wears off habituation. For the purposes of general resilience training, therefore, I would recommend that you pick the things you're going to visualize very carefully and do not attempt to face situations that seem potentially overwhelming. Start with small things and work your way up. In other words, psychologists call this graduated exposure. Don't rush things. Be systematic in your approach. The ancient Stoics left some comments that hint they may have been aware of the process of habituation. However, they didn't leave clear instructions about one key fact. The amount of time required. So in therapy, clients with clinically severe anxiety are normally asked to visualize upsetting scenes for roughly 15 to 30 minutes at a time, every day for a couple of weeks or more. One of the most common mistakes people make is cutting this process short before their feelings have had time to fully abate. And a lot of this information I kind of grabbed from cognitive behavioral therapy, mainly from like David Burns or Aaron Beck. As a rough guide, it's usually recommended that you rate the intensity of your feelings from 0 to 100%. And this is described in a lot of David Burns's work in his books, Feeling Good, and then later on Feeling Great. And he recommends to continue the exercise each day until they've reduced to at least half their peak levels. So if, for example, if you rated something at 90% on the intensity scale, you do it each day until you felt like it was down to about a 45%. Again, if you begin with easy targets, mildly upsetting events, you're likely to find the process of imaginal exposure takes about 5 to 15 minutes or less. However, practicing mindfulness strategies of the kind you've already been learning can often reduce the time required, and this varies considerably from one person to another. Don't try to force your feelings to reduce, though your goal is to accept them a bit in a detached manner and allow them to settle down naturally over time. It's very important that you don't cut the exercise short, as doing so can occasionally make negative feelings worse. You should continue to patiently visualize the problem situation until your discomfort has reduced enough. Doing this repeatedly over several days or weeks tends to lead to a permanent reduction in the emotional reaction caused. First thing you should do when picturing seemingly upsetting events is to continually remind yourself, as Epictetus said, that it's not things that upset us, but our judgments about things. Ancient Stoic students were told to have this maxim always metaphorically ready to hand to cope with adversity, and so you can repeat it to yourself as a coping statement while picturing stressful situations each day. Think of this as if you were doing mental sit-ups, mental push-ups, and strengthening your emotional resilience muscles, your Stoic principles and values. Visualizing difficult situations gives you a way to build up mental resilience even when you're not currently facing any significant emotional challenges in life. This quote-unquote cognitive distancing strategy alone, when used carefully, can have very powerful benefits during imaginal exposure. Practice it as a form of mindfulness. Be aware of your own value, judgments, and automatic thoughts, and observe them in a detached manner while you picture future events. You don't need to try to change your thinking, just observe your habitual thoughts and judgments without buying into them. Remember that an impression is just an impression and not the thing it represents, as Epictetus puts it. Don't allow yourself to be swept along by your feelings and impressions. Just do nothing in response to them except studying these subjective experiences in a detached and objective manner, as if you were observing someone else's thought processes. It's sometimes better to picture scenes more passively until your feelings have abated enough for you to begin the slightly more complex task of imagining yourself acting differently in situations that require it. For example, if you feel ready to do so, you might focus on your core values and mentally rehearse how you would respond if acting according to your conception of virtue. Perhaps doing what you would consider praiseworthy and healthy, or emulating what you imagine someone wise, just, and courageous would say and do in a similar situation. The Stoics advise us to focus on our commitment to doing the right thing and to place more importance on this than upon the other person's reaction or the outcome of the conversation. To put it in another way, you distinguish carefully between what's up to you or under your direct control and what is not in any situation you're mentally rehearsing. In a conversation, very simply, your own actions are up to you, but the other person's responses are not. When therapists train people in assertiveness skills, likewise, the first step is to often Encourage them to accept that even if you're very skilled at being assertive, the other person can still respond negatively. So if you want to handle challenging situations well, you have to remember that their behavior is not under your direct control and be willing to accept that whatever you do, your actions may fail to achieve the external outcome you'd prefer to happen. In other words, from a Stoic perspective, it's your own actions that really matter, not the other person's. Focusing on the Stoic concept of virtue as what's up to us and indifference toward what's outside our direct control can be particularly helpful when mentally rehearsing situations that require you to interact with other people. From a technical perspective in Stoic ethics, future events can be preferred or dispreferred, but only our own current actions are judged truly virtuous or vicious, good or bad, helpful or harmful. In the premeditation of adversity, however, future misfortunes are to be imagined as if they're happening right now, which actually means shifting them from the category of things dispreferred to that of things judged absolutely indifferent. In other words, for Stoics, this was a way of rehearsing total indifference and acceptance towards external misfortunes. Once they've already happened, there's no point wishing that they hadn't. We can't turn back the clock, and it would be irrational and unphilosophical to desire to do so. By pretending things we naturally want to avoid have already happened, we can prepare ourselves to cope with them if it turns out that we're unlucky and they do, in reality, befall us. Psychologists sometimes call this process of accepting things in a matter-of-fact way and focusing on coping sensibly with their consequences decatastrophizing. It requires an ability to let go of our judgments of value about things that have already happened, our judgment about them being a catastrophe and deeply distressing. If not that, it at least requires gaining distance from our distressing value judgments and focusing instead on problem solving in light of the current situation. So for the meditation for today, it will differ from some of the others in that it's intended to be practiced repeatedly and frequently throughout the day, applying your skills across a wide range of different situations and activities. This is designed to help you maintain a more general Stoic attitude toward life and build longer-term emotional resilience. You're going to try to remind yourself in a fairly rapid and frequent manner throughout the day of your Stoic principles. The idea is to introduce a structured routine that doesn't take any real time out of your day, but will spread attention to your Stoic practices throughout as much of your day as possible. Ideally, developing an attitude of Stoic mindfulness that's as near continuous as possible. A common way to do that is to remind yourself very frequently throughout each day, perhaps during every waking hour, to pause and reflect on your principles or employ some basic psychological practice, such as a mindfulness exercise for as little as 1 minute at a time. So, some things you can do. Make a rule that for the next 7 days, you're going to try to do your daily exercise at least once during each waking hour of the day. Check the time frequently and try to make sure you don't let an hour go by without doing your practice, even if it's just for 1 minute. You could set an alarm on your phone to help you remember. You can make a rule that you're never going to leave a room or begin a new activity or conversation without pausing for at least 1 minute first to engage in your daily practice. Alternative cues would be eating, drinking, or using your bathroom, which can be treated as signals to pause beforehand and to do your mindfulness practice for at least a minute. Obviously, that won't always be possible, but you can still try to use this as a reminder to do it as often as seems realistic and practical. Create cues or reminders for yourself, such as setting an alarm, changing the wallpaper on like your computer or your phone, or even tying a piece of string around your finger. People often put like software sticky notes on their computer desktops or real sticky notes around their home and office as reminders. So you may need to change these cues slightly each day so that you don't become habituated to them through overexposure and stop noticing them. People often report that it's easier to do their practice very frequently if they tell themselves something like, even if it's just for 1 minute, I'm going to do this. In reality, once you get started, you'll usually find you naturally spend a little bit longer on your exercises. People virtually never complain that this takes up too much time in their day, though, as it seldom seems to eat into time spent on other worthwhile activities. At first, as you've already learned, it can take quite a bit of determination to instigate a new pattern of behavior, but it helps to keep telling yourself that it gets easier with practice, which you're bound to find is the truth. People normally report that within a few days, it starts to feel more natural and automatic for them to pause frequently and employ their mindfulness practice. So for right now, we can do a little practice here. So we'll stop what we're doing for at least a moment and turn your attention inward and focus on observing your own mental activity from moment to moment, keeping your attention firmly grounded in the here and now. If it helps, you can close your eyes at this point. Don't try to change anything or stop anything from changing. Just notice the difference between what's up to you and what isn't. If it helps, just repeat a word in your mind each time you exhale. And notice the way you're doing this voluntarily and how other thoughts and feelings cross your mind involuntarily. Observe your automatic thoughts and feelings from an indifferent and detached perspective without buying into them, as if you were studying the thoughts of another person. Essentially, you're being asked to ground your attention in the present moment, become more attuned to your own actions and judgments, and to recall two key maxims. Some things are up to us, and some things are not. Only our own voluntary actions and judgments are under our direct control. It's not things that upset us, but our judgments about things. Remember that troubling impressions are just thoughts and not the things they claim to represent. And to wrap things up here, it should be helpful to develop a blueprint or coping plan for maintaining your resilience in the future. Review this each day to make sure you're able to follow it satisfactorily. The idea is to formulate a simple conceptualization of the habits you're most determined to overcome and to become crystal clear about the key factors you need to observe to implement any change. This doesn't necessarily take much time. You should have plenty of time to reflect on things and to try to simplify your observations. Over the past few weeks, we've done this into a handful of key observations worth remembering for the long term. A simple revised coping plan might be composed of three main elements, which can be subdivided as follows. One, your triggers, the signs or situations that you need to keep an eye on and be particularly cautious about in order to prevent yourself from relapsing into old habits. So, and two components of the triggers are the early warning signs, and these initial signs might be bodily sensations such as trembling or thoughts, such as what's the point, which you recognize as being early warning signals of unwanted reactions. And the other component is your situations. These are the high-risk situations in which you consider yourself most vulnerable to setbacks, and where you therefore need to be especially cautious and mindful of your responses. The second element is your previous response. This is the old pattern of coping, which you've decided to abandon and replace with something more constructive. These are voluntary responses. You can potentially choose to cease. And two components here are your thoughts. Sometimes this is the trickiest part because we often overlook our thoughts unless we've been practicing mindfulness carefully. For that reason, though, it's especially useful to try to identify the ways of thinking that you could do without, like unnecessary and unhelpful ways of responding. And then the actions, your actions of what is unhelpful ways of coping or behaviors could be abandoned or replaced. The hardest part of this is noticing that inaction or avoidance sometimes is in very subtle forms is often the pattern of behavior that needs to be reversed. That might include subtle patterns of mental behavior such as distracting yourself or trying to block your feelings, etc. And the third is the alternative response. This is the new way of coping that you want to introduce into the situation on the assumption that doing so will often take effort and perseverance and that you shouldn't expect to succeed perfectly first time. And the thoughts, what would be a more helpful thing to tell yourself in these situations or when you notice these early warning signs arising? This should be realistic and truthful, but also constructive and helpful, not just positive thinking in the sense of Pollyannism. And your actions, what would be a more helpful thing to do in these situations? Or when you notice these early warning signs arising, what would be a constructive way of responding or alternative to avoidance? And congratulations for getting this far in completing these last 4 weeks here. Now it's time to start putting these things into practice. Thank you, and I will see everybody next time.